The unwrap operator in the UV mapping menu is where UV mapping transitions to more of an art form, whereas these other algorithms are more limited one-click solutions that work best on simple primitive shapes. Unwrap works on all shapes and forms, including organic characters or creature models, environments, vehicles, things that are much more complex than these primitive shapes that I've used as examples. For those kinds of things, you'll likely use the unwrap operator here. And so to demonstrate this, I'm going to go ahead and delete these primitive shapes and instead use the mesh monkey because it's more of that organic, non-primitive structure that you would want to use the unwrap algorithm for. And so we'll tab into edit mode and see what unwrap gives us by default, which isn't great, namely because I cannot see the correlation between our UVs and the 3D model. With complex shapes like this, typically the unwrap will be visually relatable, as in I should be able to tell that this part is the face of our mesh, this part is the ears. Right now I can't tell any of that. And that's because there is severe UV stretching, which is a term that I mentioned earlier but never explained. And so the way that we can analyze our UV stretching is by enabling a display option. So I'll hit the N key to bring up our View Properties panel for the UV Image Editor, and then in the Display dropdown, you'll see that we have a stretch option. And the first type of stretching that's visualized is angle stretching. And then we also have area stretching, which is very different. But what's true about both of these modes is that a blue color means that the UVs more accurately represent the 3D model, whereas the red color means that they're very different from the 3D model, either through stretching or scale. Basically what that means to you is blue is good and red is bad. So obviously with area stretching, our UV layout is really bad. But with angle stretching, it's not quite so extreme. Basically the color spectrum is blue to green, so the green areas are the problem angles. So let's focus on this one right here. First of all, how can I compare it to the 3D model? I don't know where this face is, or where this vertex is rather. Speaking of vertex, as you can see, we have similar selection modes in the UV Image Editor, where I can select vertices. We can also select edges, faces, as well as UV islands. So I'm going to, select the face. And in order to see this selection in the 3D view, we can sync up the selections. By default, they are unique selection modes. But down here in the UV Image Editor, beside our Vertex Select mode, we have this button that says Keep UV and Edit Mode Selection in Sync. I'm going to enable that, and right away it adopts the selection from the 3D view. But when I select a UV face, we can see now where that face exists on the 3D model. Okay, so what about this vertex specifically? Let's switch over to Vertices and select it. Okay, that's this vertex right here. Visually, we can see that this angle is much more acute, whereas the angle in 3D is closer to a 90-degree angle. And so in the UV Image Editor, if we drag that vertex down, you'll see that the color of the angle shifts and we start to get to blue. That means it's more accurately representing the 3D model. But as we drag that down, we can see that this other angle over here gets worse. And so the art of a good UV layout is balancing the stretching. But honestly, I don't use angle stretching that much because as you can see, we don't have any red angles. And so blue and green really aren't that serious of a problem. However, area stretching, I use this all the time. And so what we want to do is somehow relieve the tension that we see in our red faces. And this can be accomplished through seams, which I can apply over here in the 3D view. I'll switch over to edge selection mode. And with a face like this, or a head model rather, it's a common approach to split the head in half down the back, but excluding the face. So with these edges selected, I can come down here to Mesh, Edges, which is also accessible with Control E, and I'm looking for Mark Seam. And you'll see in the 3D view that our edge is marked with a red highlight. And now if I select everything and hit U Unwrap, you can see that the unwrap algorithm identified those seams and disconnected those vertices. So this causes our head to kind of open up like a book from the back side. And immediately our area stretching gets much better. There's hardly any red anymore. We do have some yellow and oranges, but that's not nearly as bad as the red. However, we do still have some in the ear areas, which can be fixed with the addition of more seams. And so since the ears are an extrusion of the mesh, you can think about wrapping this with wrapping paper, how difficult that would be. And so in the context of UV unwrapping, it'll be easier just to cut off the ear from the rest of the mesh and make it its own UV island. So I will select the edges all the way around our ear extrusion. There we go, they are connected. Don't need this one though. And now if I hit Control E to mark that seam, I'm ready to unwrap again. But instead of selecting everything and hitting U unwrap, Blender offers a feature called Live Unwrap. So I'm going to undo making those selected edges a seam. And in the 3D View toolbar, the Options tab, I'm going to enable Live Unwrap. And now when I hit Control E Mark Seam, our UVs automatically update with that new unwrap. As you can see, our ear has been lopped off and the island placed separately. But there's still a lot of red and orange in there. So I want to cut another seam, let's say down this edge, so that like our head, when it opened up like a book, our ear will do that now. So Control E, Mark Seam, and immediately the ear islands are all blue and green. So that's very little stretching. However, since they both belong to the same appendage, the ear part of our mesh, I may want to keep those islands connected. And I can simply do that by selecting this edge and hitting Control E Clear Seam, which will force those vertices to stay connected in the UV layout. And from there, if I wanted to do the other ear, since it is a symmetrical mesh, I can select edges by similar type, Shift G, select Similar menu, and choose Seam. And then I can come down here to the Select menu and choose Mirror. And it will select all of the edges on the other side, Control E, Mark Seam. And with each new seam that I add, these stretched red areas go away more and more, leaving us with a better UV layout. And truthfully, there isn't one correct way to unwrap a model. It's all based on the situation, the complexity of the model, where you don't want to see seams. Because since these vertices that are along the seam are no longer touching, a problem that can result from the texture is you will see the texture doesn't line up along the seam 100% all the time. So you have to be aware of hiding that seam. But since there isn't one right way to do this, this is where the art of UV unwrapping comes into play. And since it is an art, practice is what will make perfect. So now that you know the fundamentals of Blender's unwrapping workflow, we're ready to create and paint an image texture.